Hey all, here at OS Reviews. You're watching our retro throwback review of the Motorola Droid X. So this was Motorola's flagship back in 2010, so over 8 years ago, and it had a 4.3-inch display, which was a rather large screen for the time, and one of the first Motorola devices that had a screen larger than 4 inches. And before we dive into the details and reminisce about this fairly iconic looking smartphone, as a quick size comparison, this was the Motorola Droid 2, and again, the Droid 2 is pretty much the same as the original Droid in terms of dimensions, including that slide-out keyboard, and you can see this is a 3.7-inch screen compared to this 4.3, which still seems minuscule by today's standards, especially next to, let's say, a 6-inch phone like the Redmi 5 Plus. It almost seems comically small, though even back in its heyday, the Droid X didn't have the smallest footprint among larger phones. Here's the HTC HD2, which we also did a retro review on, has the same screen size, but you can see how it's considerably smaller. Underneath the hood, we did have access to a TI 1 GHz processor coupled with 512 megabytes of RAM and 8 gigs of built-in storage expandable via micro SD card, which were all specs enough to make this thing a iconic flagship back in its day, but by today's standards, obviously those are not very good specs at all. On the bottom of the phone, we did have access to hardware keys, which took you home, back, opened up the search function, and also a menu key that opened up additional settings along with a microphone. On the edge of the phone, you have access to a micro HDMI port, which is definitely a unique feature that we would never see in any modern day phone, especially as designs become sleeker and more streamlined and thinner as well. So this enabled the Droid X to connect to an external display, allowing you to share, let's say, photos and videos on a large screen experience, which is actually still a very cool feature, to be completely honest. There's also a micro USB port for charging, and on the top here, this is where the power key was situated. The phone back then was small enough that you could still very comfortably reach and access it, unlike flagships today, which have much wider and larger panels. There's also the 3.5mm headphone jack, which is kind of a feature that we sorely miss in many of today's super thin phones. The back also had a 8 megapixel autofocus camera with dual LED flash along with a mechanical shutter. So basically when the phone is turned completely off, the shutter is a lens below the glass that will flip closed, and when you turn it on again, it will flip open. So that was a pretty cool feature. It doesn't really do too much, although it matches the namesake of this being a Droid and a very future-like smartphone. We do have a carbon fiber D-brand skin on top of this device, but originally it came with just a soft touch rubber material, and you can see how the camera back in the day did have a bump that was not very sightly, but it did make the phone pretty easy to grip using one hand, relatively slim, relatively lightweight, and 8 megapixels, which is capable of capturing HD video. On the side here, there's also a two-stage camera shutter key along with a dedicated volume rocker. The placement of the camera shutter is actually pretty convenient just because it's easy to grip the phone like this and hold it with this slightly larger chin on the other side, and makes it pretty ergonomic as far as for shooting images and videos. So photography actually was one of the highlights of the X, although it doesn't really stand up against today's current crop of flagships anymore in terms of performance. It still is a very nicely thought out design. So turning the device on, we have that 800 by 480 WVGA display, which is obviously nowhere as sharp as today's Quad HD panels, but still shows off colors reasonably well and has a pretty generous viewing angle as well. The top has a earpiece and a proximity light sensor, and we are greeted immediately to Android either 2.2 or 2.3 Gingerbread, depending on whether you've upgraded the phone or not. So it's definitely been a while, and we have access to Moto Blur, which was Motorola's skin on top of Android back in the day. Obviously, since Motorola has now been acquired by Lenovo, there have been dramatic changes in their overhaul of making the skin look quite different, some even very stock and vanilla, but back in the day, the Moto Blur interface was definitely heavy-handed. There was still the drag-down notification tray, there was the battery indicator, and there is that consolidated app drawer on the bottom there, and Blur also had an emphasis on social media, so you could open up widgets just for Twitter or Facebook and consistently be connected to updates as they streamed in, which catered for the younger crowd, but unfortunately drained the battery of the phone very quickly and also made the device kind of sluggish because there would be so many tasks going on behind the hood. So just like today's current line of Droid flagships, the X was an exclusive for Verizon. Although I'm not a huge fan of carrier-specific devices, it's a it stayed at Verizon for a long time. And here, of course, we do have a number of preloaded bloatware that are the consequence of this collaboration. And that includes VCast and VZ Navigator, along with voice command apps and some light versions of games, including an NFL game that was built on here, and of course a large number of Motorola apps, as well as Blockbuster, Amazon Kindle, Amazon MP3 player, things like that. Luckily, you can uninstall many of these programs if you don't want to use them, but it definitely took up a large portion of the memory the first time that you took this thing out of the box. Alright, so let's take a quick look at the camera. So 8 megapixels, if you think about it, it really isn't that bad. There are still plenty of mid-tier phones on the market 8 years later that still have a 8 megapixel sensor, some even less. So that is one regard where, the X was surprisingly ahead of its time, again, that camera. Of course, again, technology has evolved pretty dramatically since then for the camera space on phones in terms of autofocusing with face detection, laser autofocus. Those were all technologies that didn't exist on smartphones back then, but we did have geotagging that used our location and could map it to specific photos. It actually focuses onto images surprisingly well, and although low light performance, of course, isn't going to be nearly as impressive, it does have an LED flash that also works reasonably well. The interface back then, you can see, was very simple. I could select different scenes for quick filters. I could also add various effects. I can switch to recording video, but the X did not have a front-facing camera, so you can't use it for video chatting. And a quick look at some of the images that I took with this thing a few days ago when I pulled it out of the drawer, you can see that you can pinch and zoom, but it definitely is a little bit choppy when you are zooming, and you have to wait a second before the image snaps into focus. But as a whole, really not that bad, surprisingly, for such an old camera. And you can see that colors are captured pretty nicely, as well as details. It looks actually pretty realistic. So as far as taking quick snaps, this is an area that I was fairly impressed with the X. Even today, as I kind of look back on this fairly iconic looking phone. Of course, after the X, Motorola continued with making Droids, and one of the trends that they were going for after this phone came out was the Droid Razr, as well as the Bionic series, that all kind of had this very slim portfolio. They made this overall hump even more prominent on the Razr in particular, just by minimizing the chassis here, but the hump still remained in place because of the camera restrictions, but had overall a very similar aesthetic to the X, as you see here. Alright, so next let's take a look at the browser and see how that's held up through the many years. This was still the original WebKit-based browser that came bundled with Google. Today it's been replaced largely by Chrome, that's baked into most stock installs of Android. If we ask it to load up the New York Times, let's just see how long this will take. It's the mobile version, not the full desktop version, which I suspect will be a little bit too much for such an old device, and we'll be waiting for quite a long time. But you can see for complex pages, especially ones with lots of videos, ads, as well as dynamic moving elements, it definitely will take longer, and there's a bit more choppiness here and there than back in its heyday. That being said, it still is, able to open up most of these pages, and you can still read back text and view back these images without too many issues. And here's Amazon loading up. Again, a lot of security warnings popping up all over the place. No longer really I would say, super usable experience with the WebKit browser, although you can, again, download Chrome and it becomes a lot faster, as well as you won't see as many error messages because the certificates for security are out of date. You can see beep, bop, beep as Amazon is loading up here, but you get the overall idea that it still is surprisingly decent. I would say it's not really something that you would want to use as a daily driver anymore. And there's also access to a GPS, which works pretty well for Google Maps and navigation for turn-by-turn directions. That's an area that hasn't really changed. If you are picking this up as maybe a backup GPS device, it still works decently for that, I'd say. For quick shortcuts, we can long hold on the search key to bring up a voice dialog here. So for instance, Moto G. And you can see that it actually does a pretty good job. I can also just tap on it once to bring up the search key here. Furthermore, I could long hold on the home icon here to open up my multitasking of recent apps. So that was a pretty rudimentary setup back in the day, but it did work. And I can tap on it once to take a look at different pages all at once in this leap format. I can tap on back, and under settings here, I can also change profiles for things like work versus home. It allows you to reshuffle things like the wallpaper as well as apps displayed on the home screen. That's more or less our retro throwback look at the Motorola Droid X revisited 8 years later, and we can really tell how far we've come in terms of smartphone technology, both with processing speed as well as how displays have gotten larger and larger, as well as how Motorola, now Lenovo's designs, have changed through the years. Thanks for watching this video here at OS Reviews, and be sure to comment below if you've owned the Droid X back when it was first released, whether you have any specific memories to share, and whether you think this is still a device that can be used maybe as a backup or put into other use as a security camera here in 2018, because interestingly, the X will still pick up on Amazon or eBay, and it remains one of the least expensive Android phones that you can still find on there for under $10. So thanks for watching this video here at OS Reviews. This was a look back at the Motorola Droid X.